Now, for all the brown rivers and strange sounds you just saw and heard, those weren't clips from the inside of a Taco Bell bathroom. What you just witnessed were mud volcanoes. You might not have heard of mud volcanoes before, let alone laid eyes on one, but their endless bubbling and gloopy gurgling are some of the most strangely satisfying sights and sounds nature can offer. So let's dive into this fascinating and filthy world of mud bubbles, bursts, and explosions. All natural New Zealand. First up, there's a big difference between a mud volcano and a mud pot. Just like lava-filled volcanoes, both these muddy monuments form along areas of weaknesses in the Earth's crust, such as fault lines or subduction zones. But unlike regular volcanoes, they form in places that are only heated by the Earth's molten interior, known as geothermically active areas. So instead of lakes of lava, some sites like Waioripu in New Zealand turn into superheated springs of bubbling mud, also known as mud pots.
I don't know. It has something funny. I'm not sure.
Who knew watching mud bubbles could be so relaxing? Though I don't imagine those photographers would have been half as calm if those were lava bubbles. Fortunately, these geothermal features are much cooler than their volcanic cousins. While molten hot lava can reach a spicy 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, Waioripu's mud pots only hit a fraction of that at around 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's because they're created by hot spring activity, where volcanic gases, mainly carbon dioxide, are emitted from boiling liquids deep within the Earth's crust. This is thanks to their proximity to the Earth's red-hot molten magma layer. As these gases rise to the surface, they mix with groundwater to produce a kind of acidic slurry. It's so acidic that it slowly dissolves the surrounding rock and turns the area into an ever-bubbling mud pot. Occasionally, a small buildup of these gases can explode spectacularly, spewing mud loudly in every direction. But they don't just create puny puddles. A little over 16 miles from Waioripu are the geothermal pools, geysers, and mud pots of Waikarewa. As you can see, these fuming features take up huge swaths of landscape, but they're not as cool as those at Waioripu, literally. With all that steam, the Earth's crust here is thin, a little under 10 miles to be exact, which is a shocking half of the world's average crust thickness. Being so close to the molten hot magma layer, these pools are heated up to a hellish 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which produces billowing spires of steam. Somehow the sight of all that steam really adds to the simmering satisfaction. Terrifying Trinidad and Tobago. Mud pots can be super satisfying, but mud volcanoes, on the other hand, don't simmer away so innocently. On February 22, 1997, the little village of Piparo on the Caribbean island nation of Trinidad and Tobago was rocked by this massive muddy eruption. Thankfully, a series of small tremors and loud rumblings shook the area briefly beforehand, giving residents just enough time to evacuate the area. And thank God they did, because just minutes later, a 50-foot geyser of magmatic mud exploded out of the earth, forcing everyone nearby to flee. Approximately 500,000 barrels of mud spewed quickly over more than a square mile of land, burying cars and homes before hardening into concrete like clay. But for all the destruction, fortunately no lives were lost, although 31 families were permanently displaced. Today, almost 25 years later, you can still see the mud-swallowed buildings and absolute carnage that was left in its wake. Unlike a mud pot's slow bubbling, this unpredictable eruption was caused by a huge buildup of natural gases in the Earth's crust. Scientists believe this is because Trinidad and Tobago is perched on a complex tectonic striate. So even the slightest shift in the Earth's crust can cause explosive gas releases. Not only that, but the mud that's dredged up during a mud volcano eruption is much thicker than that of a mud pot, leaving massive mud domes like this in their wake. And that becomes clear when you discover Trinidad and Tobago's other explosive mud volcano. On February 12, 2018, visitors to an area known as the Devil's Woodyard noticed small gas bubbles popping on the surface. At the time, no one thought much of it, but this was just a warning of what was about to come. Less than a day later, that same vent suddenly started spewing out masses of mud. The thick sludge was blasted more than 20 feet into the air and completely coated parts of the surrounding area in 20 feet of magmatic mud. A bird's-eye view of the site then revealed more than 4 acres of land had been entirely consumed by the eruption. That's about the same area as 2 whole soccer pitches. And look, the wave of mud was so thick and powerful that it practically bulldozed the area's topsoil away. Thankfully, no one was injured, and as chaotic as it was, you can't deny that watching all this unfold is weirdly satisfying to behold. Now, if you want even more videos that scratch an itch you didn't know you had, then be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. I upload all the oddly satisfying content I can find, from machinery you'll marvel at to wonderful work you won't want to stop watching. So stick with me and I promise to keep you satisfied. Now, where were we? Roiling, Romania. Have you ever wanted to visit the moon Neil Armstrong style? Well, if you travel to the hidden wilds of the Volcanoes Noroiosi Reserve, deep in the forests of Romania, you'll be greeted by this spectacular lunar-looking landscape, along with a few alien noises to boot. These are locally known as the Burka Mud Volcanoes. The entire reservation takes up the same area as 112 football fields, and it's here that these mud volcanoes have bubbled up and dried repeatedly over the decades to create these curious cones, some of which are almost 20 feet high. As their steady eruptions of natural gas dredge up salt water and sludge to the surface, it flows away in little rivulets that carve channels through the older layers of dried mud. As strange as it sounds, it's pretty hypnotic to watch. These rivers of mud coat the landscape in a salty, clay-like sludge, which hardens and cracks on hot days. Very little vegetation can survive in such a harsh, salt-saturated environment, save for the odd hardy plants here and there, which is why the site hasn't turned green. The area was also protected by the government from any human interference almost 100 years ago, and has continued to ooze around naturally ever since. But what really makes these mud volcanoes extraordinary are their location. Volcanic activity is rarely seen around Europe, unless you're in Iceland or Italy, due to the positioning of the Earth's slow-moving tectonic plates. But Romania contains several tectonic blocks, whose age-old collisions have given rise to the amazing Carpathian Mountains, as well as these amazingly misplaced mud volcanoes. Whoa, muddy hell. Incredible Iceland. Now, Romania may not be famous for its volcanic activity, but its European buddy Iceland definitely is. Just take a look at the foothills of Namafjall, one of Iceland's most famous volcanic mountains. Unlike the land around the Burka mud volcanoes, there's no greenery for as far as the eye can see, leaving this place looking like a desert. But instead of tumbleweeds, great spires of steam roll over this landscape. These are fueled by the area's amazing mud pots, which boil with a relentless amount of energy. As fun as they are to watch, the waters making up these masses of mud need to be approached with caution. Depending on where you are in the roughly 12 million square foot field of hot springs, some of this mud can reach almost 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's not just super hot mud pots steaming up the atmosphere. Billowing springs called fumaroles have burst the ground open to let steam building up in the Earth's crust escape, like Mother Nature's own pressure valve. But as pure as all this white steam looks, it doesn't smell that great. The volcanically sulfurous stench emitted by these vents and mud pots smells distinctly like rotten eggs. Ugh. Although, with strangely satisfying sights and sounds like this, I think I could pinch my nose for a couple of hours. Simmering Salton Sea. California is home to the famous San Andreas Fault, so it's no surprise to see mud volcanoes popping up around this area, literally. Located close to the rim of the Salton Sea, this area is made up of 2 square miles of mesmerizing mud pots and mud volcanoes. And while their presence in this area of tectonic activity might not be surprising, something about them really is. They're moving. Emitting around 40,000 gallons of water a day, this roiling mass of carbon dioxide and slurry is gradually creeping across California at a staggering rate of about 20 feet a year. And as you can imagine, it's becoming a progressive problem. In 2018, this mud spring suddenly shifted southwest, threatening to disrupt the nearby Union Pacific railway lines. Now, in 2021, thanks to the magic of Google Maps, you can see it spread even further, although the mounds of meddlesome mud have thankfully been diverted away from the tracks using a massive 100-foot wall. But what's really weird about this event is that the mud pots appear to be moving at right angles to California's famous fault lines, so its movement, confusingly, doesn't seem to be linked to the area's seismic activity. While this currently has scientists scratching their heads, I suggest we all just sit back and enjoy the pleasant gurgling of this mysterious mud while it lasts. KAOHSIUNG, Taiwan. Now, the sheer power of these pressurized mud gaskets isn't the only awesome thing about them. Gases that they release can range from acidic hydrogen sulfide, like those in New Zealand and Iceland, to flammable methane, like these in KAOHSIUNG, Taiwan. Oh, I could listen to that all day. Now, the mud pools here are made up of mainly organic material, and as bacteria break it down, they also produce underground pockets of methane as a byproduct. But when it bubbles to the surface, a single spark can transform this flammable gas into a fiery phenomenon.
It's really rocking now. Wow.
Eventually, this pocket of gas was depleted and died out after 5 minutes, but I think I speak for everyone watching when I say hot damn. Underwater wonder. Like regular volcanoes, mud volcanoes don't just form on land. Around 1,400 feet below the waves off the coast of KAOHSIUNG, gas bubbles the size of basketballs suddenly erupt from the top of this sunken mud volcano. Just like KAOHSIUNG's fiery fountain, these brilliant bubbles are also full of methane gas. But the high pressure and low temperatures of this underwater environment change the state of the mud volcano's appearance. As the muddy solution makes its way up from the molten subsurface, it slowly solidifies into a fine sediment when it hits the heavy layer of water above. The gas in these streams sometimes disperses through the sediment and is released gradually. But if a buildup of gas and pressure occurs in a highly active mud volcano channel like this one, big bubbles can work through the sediment and release almost explosively. As weirdly wonderful as it is to watch, I can't help but wonder what those bubbles sound like as they're released. Is it a bloop or a glurp? Or, maybe even a bloop, 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 bloop? Hey, you know what? What do you think it sounds like? Give me your best deep sea bubble impression down in the comments. Mellow Yellowstone. So when it comes to mud pots and mud springs, there's only one true king of the pond. And these are the mud pots of Wyoming's Yellowstone National Park. And they look just as gloopily glorious as they sound. Is anyone else craving fondue right about now? As tempting as it would be to stick your hand in this simmering sludge, it's the last thing you should do. And that's because the entirety of Yellowstone National Park is an active supervolcano. While it doesn't look like a typical volcano site, the bubbling mud pots and boiling hot geysers are an indicator of just how much heat lies beneath the surface. The steam temperature fueling some of these bubbles has been recorded at a staggering 350 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's not just the heat that should stop you from sticking your limbs into this forbidden fondue. You can usually smell these mud pots before you can see them, and not in a good way. Like those in Iceland, their stomach-turning stench has been likened to rotten eggs, which comes from the volcanic hydrogen sulfide gas they emit. Not only does it give them a bad smell, but it also turns the mud acidic. Some of the park's geothermal features have a pH acidity of 2, which is about as strong as stomach acid, and it can have some hideous consequences. Back in 2016, an unfortunate tourist accidentally fell into one of these superheated mud springs. His sister desperately tried to pull him out of the sticky situation, but he was stuck fast and gradually sank. Rescue crews were unable to get him out in time, and by the next day, all they could find were his wallet and shoes. The news later reported that the man's entire body had likely been dissolved by the super hot mud pot overnight. So, unless you fancy being slowly digested in the muddy stomach of this park, remember to keep your hands to yourself. Red Hot Russia. As you've seen, most mud pots and mud volcanoes usually cover the landscape in great swaths of gray mud. But there's one surprisingly colorful exception in the far-flung reaches of the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, in an area aptly named the Valley of the Geysers. Say hello to the Krasny Gorshok, or for those of us that aren't too hot on the old Russian, the Red Mud Pot. This mud pot lies within a collapsed volcanic cone, which erupted approximately 40,000 years ago. It continues to steam in places where magma can heat the groundwater to near boiling temperatures. But that striking shade of soil is derived from the region's high content of iron and aluminum oxides, which give it that warm, rusty color. Guess this proves red really is a steamy color. Immense Indonesia. Indonesia is famous for its spectacular landscapes and breathtaking temples, but it's also home to a much darker tourist attraction that's unnervingly satisfying to watch: the Sidoarjo mud volcano. In May 2006, a natural gas blowout on the Indonesian island of Java caused a colossal eruption of mud, which spewed out of the earth at a record rate. At its peak, this mud volcano, known as Lucy, spewed out 6 million cubic feet of mud every day. That's the equivalent of pouring about 68 Olympic swimming pools of mud over the landscape every 24 hours. And the worst part is that it hasn't stopped oozing since. The relentless ooze has buried the surrounding land in up to 130 feet of mud in some places, enough to submerge these buildings right up to their roofs. Today, the mud covers an area spanning more than 6 square miles, claiming the homes of more than 13,000 families, and it's not showing signs of stopping anytime soon. But it's not Indonesia's only unstoppable mud volcano. Around 140 miles west of Sidoarjo lies the Great Grey Field of Bledug-Kuwu, a geothermically active hotspot. The masses of mud have spilled out over the area the same size as 8 football fields, and in the most spectacular way possible. These bubbles of carbon dioxide gradually cut their way through the super salty sludge from deep within the earth and are finally released into those stunning white clouds of vapor. While most of these bubbles reach up to a meter high, at their most active they can measure a whopping 10 meters tall. That's nearly 6 times the height of an average person. And you know what they say, the bigger they rise, the harder they, pop. Amazing Azerbaijan. In October 2001, the quiet hills overlooking the Azerbaijani capital of Baku suddenly erupted in a terrifying torrent of fire. The scary spire of flame reached a colossal 65 feet into the air and hurled tons of debris and black smoke into the sky for 3 whole days. But what's even more terrifying is that Azerbaijan doesn't have a single active volcano, at least not in the usual fire-spewing sense. That's right, this is actually a mud volcano, one of more than 400 littered around Azerbaijan. That's almost half of all known mud volcanoes in the world. They come from the huge natural gas reserves under the land and sea in the Caspian region, which slowly, or sometimes explosively, seep up to the surface. And while this one hasn't been lit on purpose, the high temperatures from the earth and the climate can sometimes ignite the gas, making their massive eruptions all the more terrifying. Although they're not always so intimidating. These baby bubbles are formed about 50 miles along Azerbaijan's coast in Gobistan, and the sounds they make are truly spectacular. And just wait for it. These oozing mounds of once subterranean sediment aren't only much smaller than their Baku brothers, but they're also cold. Although scientists don't fully understand how these mud volcanoes can be cold, they're so tepid that you can actually clamber in and swim around in them. Although, you have to be okay with looking like you've let out a fart or two. Well, now that we've reached the end, how many times do you reckon I said the word mud during that video? 20? 50? 2 million? Honestly, I was too busy being weirdly satisfied to count. Put your best guess down in the comments below, and thanks for watching.